Welcome to CityWorks, a co-production of the City University of New York School of Labor and Urban Studies and CUNY TV. I'm Laura Flanders. Each month here on CityWorks, we explore the challenges and lived experiences of working people on the job, at home, and in our communities. On today's program, Pride in the Labor Movement, LGBTQ+ activism and leadership have been on the rise in recent years in organized labor. These activists are leading the charge in union campaigns at Starbucks, the News Guild, the Writers Guild of America, and many graduate student unions across the country, to name just a handful. With LGBTQ+ people in leadership now front and center among a new generation of labor militants, we ask, what has led to this rise of LGBTQ presence in unions and other social movements? And why is the labor movement such a fertile ground for this development? Will this prominence of queer folks in the fight for worker rights further empower both the queer folks and the movement in the fight against violence and the quest for social justice for everyone? With us today to help us unravel these questions is Professor Joanna Wuest of Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts, who's researched and written about the prominent role LGBTQ+ leaders are playing in today's labor movement. But first, we welcome Richard Blum, longtime staff attorney in the Employment Law Unit of the Legal Aid Society. He's an early member of Pride at Work, a founding board member of Queers for Economic Justice, and a member of the LGBTQ+ caucus of his union, which is the Association of Legal Aid Attorneys, UAW Local 2325. Ricky, may I call you that? Welcome to CityWorks. It's so glad to see you, my friend.
Glad to see you.
We should just state at the outset that we have, both of us, seen a lot of change over our lifetimes as queer people with a care and a heart for unions and labor. If you were to single out one example of leadership today that perhaps would have been unimaginable when you started out, I'm going to guess 70s, 80s, 90s, take your pick. Who would it be?
I started at Legal Aid in 1990. I would say that the leadership, the queer leadership in the Starbucks union campaign has been the thing that has most excited me, partly because the campaign itself has so much excited me and has that quality of a real grassroots movement. So I think, that's the kind of leadership. It isn't one person, it's about groups of people coming together and acting in solidarity.
So to talk a bit about the role that LGBTQ people are playing is to jump over the question of why there is a need for unions among queer folks. Talk a bit about what is the reality for LGBTQ+ people in the workforce today, because the statistics are pretty dire and quite different sometimes from the kind of cultural representation we have of queer glamour.
Yeah. Well, I've often pointed out that all of us, really, almost all of us, survive on some combination of money from the labor market, our families, and the government. And if all three of those things are hostile to you, you're in trouble. This is why I sort of cut my teeth in these issues in the context of welfare reform, or so-called welfare reform, and why QEJ started with a meeting that was called Why Welfare Reform is a Queer Issue. Because queer people, if you're excluded from the labor market, if you're not even hired in the first place, or if you're so badly bullied that you can't hold a job, then where do you turn? Well, if your family doesn't accept you, then where do you turn? The government. Well, if the government is there to discipline you, to teach you to be a good employee and to get along with your family, you're really in trouble. So I think that, that there's a deep consciousness among workers who are queer that they need to have some kind of position and power, collective power in the workplace, because their vulnerability is so enormous. They also have the experience, most of us, right, of coming out often, not always obviously, but often under adverse circumstances and having to challenge. It's, maybe your family accepts you, maybe not, but if not your family, then your school, your whoever, in your life, your circle of friends, people around you in the neighborhood, whoever it is, that we've had the experience of having to challenge the norms and mores of people in authority around us. So we've been through that round already by the time we get to the workplace.
So how is it changing the labor movement, you think? We often talk on this program about how the labor movement is changing with more women, more people of color, more immigrants, more worker centers feeding into the movement, non-formal unions feeding into the movement. How is the labor movement being changed by all this presence of?
Well, I think you now hear when labor leaders speak, they include LGBTQ people. At least they give lip service to those issues now, which was unheard of when I started out. And I think you also see it being articulated sincerely. So I'll give you a good example from a month ago. I was lucky enough to be able to attend the Community Action or Political Action Conference, National Conference of the UAW. I'm a longtime UAW member, and I won a lottery with my local to go.
Yay, auto workers.
And we had an opening speech by Shawn Fain, the current president of the UAW, who was a remarkable person, and I had been following this, every broadcast during the strike, carefully and with rapt attention. And he's a remarkable leader, visionary, strategic. And his theme was that the owning class is trying to divide us, and we have to stand together. A worker's a worker's a worker. And in his sort of riff on this, one of the examples he gave was he said, whatever the gender identity or sexual orientation of the person next to you on the assembly line, you're your coworker. Yeah. They're your sibling in this. Now, to have the leader of a national industrial manufacturing union make a point of talking about solidarity from that perspective was extraordinary to me. And I have to say, speaking to some of the other queer people who were there, we were all very moved by this.
I bet.
And I think sometimes we're a little jaded, but that really hit me.
Yeah. And the flip side, of course, of this is that this very nexus between queers and labor, organized queers and organized labor, is a target for the right. I was looking at the Heritage Foundation's hundreds of pages long agenda for the next conservative administration. It doesn't matter who the candidate is, they're ready with their plan, Project 2025. You can find out more about it if you want online. But their number one first action of the Labor Department is to strip out the employment protections that currently exist for LGBT people in federal law, meaning for federal employees, which are the ones that we have. I thought that was extraordinary, that was the first thing they were going to go for, to strip those protections away for federal employees. That, it seemed to me, indicated that they see a strength there that maybe even queer organizers in the labor movement aren't seeing yet.
Do you mean you think that they see strength on our side?
Yes.
Yes, I think that's true.
As if that's a string they want to pull to unravel something.
Yes. Well, and we know that trans people in particular have become a favorite target. They've sort of given up on gay marriage, I think. That's just too popular these days to win a wedge fight over. So trans people are the new wedge, or one of the new wedges. Yes, I think the backlash is a sign of the success of the movement.
Where do you think the front line is now for this movement, these two movements that you bring together in your life? What are you working on today? We still haven't gotten national health care, so that's still on the
I would
agenda.
say let's start with access to health care, and again, gender appropriate, culturally appropriate health care. But I'll start with health care. And violence. I mean, I think we have to deal with violence. There's been a lot of discussion in recent years about sexual harassment in the workplace. But we have to understand that, first of all, sexual harassment isn't only men against women, and it's not only about, sort of the power play of straight men. It's more complicated than that. But it's about power abuse, and that violence in the workplace of various forms still exists. Bullying is real. Everyone should read Anne Bailey's books, Steel Closets, about LGBTQ steelworkers in Gary, Indiana, and Semi-Queer, my favorite book title, about queer truckers. And you really appreciate the day-to-day risk of violence in the workplace for queer people. We at QEJ had a forum on workplace bullying. Now this must be over 10 years ago at this point. One of the speakers was a woman who's a member of Labor's Local 79, one of my favorite unions, and she teaches a course called Respect in the Workplace. So this is someone who's an out African-American lesbian who at that time had worked 5 years already in construction, mostly union construction. And she was talking about the hazing of women generally, because she was saying it really isn't so much about her being a lesbian, it's that women get hazed in construction projects, right? But then I asked her, and she said that she would, never want to work in a non-union construction project, that within a union construction project, at least you have some place to go, some place to turn, and there's a structure for combating that stuff on the ground right there. And I've written about this, the importance of having power on the ground if you're serious about anti-discrimination laws and reality for people. But then I asked her, because I think she'd had quite a track record as an advocate for women. I said, how many out gay men have you met on the job in your 5 years in construction as a very visible out lesbian? She said, none. That's the kind of safety we're talking about.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ricky. Thank you for all your work. And I encourage people to continue to watch this program. We had Anne Bailey on not so long ago.
Oh, great.
Wonderful speaking with you. We're going to take a quick break and return with Joanna Wuest. You are watching CityWorks.
The CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies is the 25th and newest school under the CUNY umbrella. Dedicated to public service and social justice, the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies offers undergraduate and graduate degrees in the areas of labor studies and urban studies, and certificate programs in labor relations, public administration and public policy, healthcare policy and administration, and community leadership. We pride ourselves on being an institution that brings together activists and academics. Find out more at slu.cuny.edu.
Welcome back to CityWorks. Joining me now is Joanna Wuest, Assistant Professor of Politics at Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts. She specializes in gender and sexuality politics. Her article on the prominent role that LGBTQ+ leaders are playing in today's labor movement appears in the Spring 24 edition of New Labor Forum, the journal published by the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. So first off, just congratulations so much on this super important article. You make a case that LGBTQ advocacy has become central to the new union militancy. Where are we seeing it, just in a nutshell? What kind of examples do you think of?
So we're really seeing the kind of centering of sexual and gender workers' rights and particular issues that are important to them across the labor movement in general. For one, we see established unions like the American Federation of Teachers and the National Education Association fighting for their rank and file workers' rights as they face kind of crackdowns in states like Florida with these new Don't Say Gay laws and other laws that are attacking both queer students, but also any teachers that are teaching these kind of issues in the classroom. We see unions like the UAW establishing new queer caucuses, United Steel Workers adding gender-affirming healthcare to their healthcare plans for workers as well as their families who might need access to that potentially life-saving care. And we're also seeing these issues centered by new unions like Starbucks Workers United, who this past summer staged a kind of nationwide action when their parent company, this kind of supposed vanguardist in corporate America for trans rights, was saying, we need to take down pride decorations. We can't have anything that looks like we're celebrating queer life. And that's because I think those workers saw this as a real capitulation to this new anti-queer rights trend that we see across the country.
And the point you make in the article, one of them, is that this makes perfect sense for LGBTQ workers to get involved in unions because they're often the bottom of the economic barrel, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we see statistics put out by the Williams Institute recently that shows that LGBTQ plus Americans experience on whole higher rates of poverty than their straight cisgender peers. And importantly, that's in a country where we already have very high rates of debt, inadequate health insurance, particularly at-will employment is already very widespread. We know housing instability is widespread. And then they're kind of at the lower rung of that. Trans people actually exhibit even higher rates of poverty than most other cross sections of the queer population. And when we see kind of attempts to dig into the sources of those disparities, those like the Human Rights Campaign have put out reports saying that this is largely rooted in what they called, quote, some of society's most challenging issues. And those included unaffordable health care, workplace discrimination, reduced employment opportunities, just all sorts of things that unions already kind of provide to their workers.
Finally, there may be people that say, okay, well, aren't there also nonprofit groups, great advocacy organizations? You mentioned the Human Rights Campaign not long ago. Don't those groups work effectively to defend LGBT workers?
I wouldn't want to say that those groups don't do things like pursue these kinds of Title VII protections in the law. I think we see a lot of national civil rights and LGBTQ plus nonprofits being really instrumental to opening those doors in the courts. And that has a real impact for workers. But at the same time, those nonprofits are very beholden to wealthy donors, oftentimes even corporations funnel money into these nonprofits. And it just means that they're not able or willing to fight for the things that would really kind of improve LGBTQ plus workers' lives as a whole. In other words, we're never going to see them fighting for single-payer healthcare. We're not going to see them fighting for, all the sorts of really rich substantive things that unions and working class organizations in general struggle for.
Try as we might. And then finally, there's 2 points that you make in your piece that I want to make sure we just touch on, although I encourage people to check out New Labour Forum. One is how unions have been able to sort of pierce the illusion of these so-called culture wars as kind of a distraction from what is really the economic motivation underlying a lot of these campaigns. There's one example that you've mentioned in Florida. Are there others?
So culture war is one of the greatest kind of misnomers in American politics. And that's because even if we go back decades and decades before Ron DeSantis's kind of targeting of queer people and trans people in the state of Florida, while pursuing kind of plutocratic politics and the destruction of unions kind of more generally, we see that trend all the way back at least to the 1970s in California, where you had a very similarly kind of fundamentally anti-labor, anti-working class state senator named John Briggs. And he thought it would be a great way to divide the working class by passing this ballot initiative that would have barred gay and lesbian teachers from working in public schools. And unions across California, many of which were not exactly run by the most queer-friendly people in the world. I think this was before we had kind of queer caucuses and rich representation in these unions. They realized that an injury to one was an injury to all, and they knew what John Briggs was doing here. And they successfully thwarted and beat back that ballot initiative. And so again, I think we can see that where these kind of right-wing politicians want to divide workers, they want to scapegoat queer people en route to destroying labor and public schools and public goods more generally. These things kind of show us why we're not experiencing kind of culture wars right now, but rather this kind of scapegoating of queer people.
And unions can get it done. Thank you so much. Thank you, Joanna Wuest. Really helpful. Again, the article we've been referring to is in the spring issue of New Labour Forum from the City University of New York School of Labor and Urban Studies. Joanna, thanks a lot. Recently, I hosted a virtual public program at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies about transgender-led movement building, in which we explored campaigns and strategies for protecting transgender rights and generating political and worker power for LGBTQIA+ communities in an election year. Here are some highlights from that program.
We constantly hear stories of our transgender community constantly getting fired for the littlest, smallest thing. And it's literally because of who they are, because they started to transition, because they started to express how they want to be affirmed. They changed their name.
And so we see also large growing amounts of extremist right groups coming into local school boards or school districts to organize against trans youth, and all the hard work that many youth activists, LGBT activists, trans activists have worked so hard over decades to get to. And those rights and those areas of gains are being eroded every day. And so we need to reinforce, we need to build up, we need to really reach out to our allies, but also organize within, and making sure that we have coalitions, that we have alliances that are strong, that are healthy, that are actually working towards that systemic change we need.
I think nationally, I would like to see people on the left meet people, match the energy of people on the right. I think, you know, Biden for the past several years has been telling trans people that he has our backs. And someone once recently said, we're still waiting to see how Biden has our back specifically. I think that the federal government's inability to pass the Equality Act is a clear demonstration of them being derelict in their duty, when in 30 plus states in this country, you can marry whoever you want, but you can be fired, or you can be evicted rather, or denied services based upon your gender identity and expression. I think that we know rather that there's a well-funded, well-coordinated effort on the right to eliminate transgender people from public life. And they just are organized. They're all equally wacky, and they are thinking strategic and long term. And here we are on the left, afraid to utter the words transgender, or afraid to lean in and be unapologetic about our support for people, regardless of how they identify.
I feel that this is a incredibly important time to organize, but it's the solution is not going to come from the top. It never has, and it never will. And we have to push it from the bottom. And that means organizations like my organization align with organizations that do that electoral-based organizing work, moving beyond then just these strategies towards strategies that are really going to build power and change systems. Because when a Black trans woman is able to be housed and not have to worry about where her next meal is, that will benefit all of us. All of us, all our conditions are raised by that, by those opportunities. And so whether it's foster kids, whether it's trans folks getting support through UBI, Universal Basic Income programs of that sort, these are important fundamental programs that will lift and change lives. And the more those lives are changed for the better, the more our communities will be as a whole.
This is certainly a time period where there's a need for all of us to show up, to speak out, and we can do that in many different ways. My advice to young or up-and-coming trans leaders, advocates, activists is you don't have to always be in advocacy. You have a right to live a soft, peaceful, normal life. And it's okay for you to do that too. And that is also a contribution to our community, because doing this work for several years, I find that it is physically and mentally draining and exhausting, the over politicization of trans people, the fact that trans people are the pathway to the White House in 2024 is just, absurd. And I think that we can really dwell on it. And I think that if we do that too much, we will deprive ourselves of the joy that we deserve as human beings. And so I just want to remind trans people that it can feel like just being trans means being a calling into advocacy and activism. And that's not the case. And I think that if that's for you, then great, do it. But if not, there are so many ways that you can contribute to the advancement and the betterment of our community. We need to be in all circles and spaces, in the front and the back, inside, outside, all of it.
So I feel like I knew my privilege, and I decided to stand up and not hide behind the shadows of a cisgender woman. I said, you know what, I'm a transgender woman, I'm proud, and I'm standing up for my sister. So I wanted to give people a voice that didn't have a voice for themselves. So that's my drive. And just to see my community grow, I hope and pray that we are all able to grow and be resilient and just be able to live authentic lives.
Those were some highlights from a panel discussion on transgender-led organizing and strategies for building political, social, and worker power for LGBTQIA+ communities this election year. It was organized by the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. That's it for CityWorks. If you have comments or questions, write to us at cityworks@slu.cuny.edu. For CityWorks, I'm Laura Flanders. Thanks for watching.